We talk Alabama football with Stephen M. Smith of Touchdown Alabama each and every week, at least once a week. You can catch Stephen on his show the way it is, Fox 97.9, Monday through Friday, 2 to 4 Central Time. So before we tear into some possibilities, some playoff scenarios, your thoughts about the college football rankings. I had no issue with the rankings. I don't think that there were any egregious errors or mindsets or thought approaches in the college football playoff rankings. I did have a particular team at number one in my rankings that make sense. I actually have the team that hasn't lost a game at number one. But besides that, your thoughts about the rankings that came out, whether you agree with them or not, and if they're telling us something about what the committee values, because that seems to sway back and forth depending on the week and the teams involved.
There is definitely a pendulum when it comes down to the college football playoff rankings. I will say that. There's definitely a pendulum. You can see some weeks they weigh heavy on strength of schedule. Some weeks they weigh heavy on head-to-head and top 25 wins and how did this particular team look after you played them. So many different mechanisms, but I had no issues with the top 25 rankings, in particular the top four. You look at Clemson. Clemson continues to win. They have the ACC title game right in front of them with Miami. It's in, no question about it. Auburn at number two. I mean, who would have thought? Auburn lost to LSU, who lost to Troy. Nobody thought Auburn would be in this situation. Auburn continued to win. The pieces fell exactly where the Tigers would have liked for them to fall, even though I'm pretty sure Gus Malzahn, Chip Lindsey, Kevin Steele, none of those three expected it. Auburn defeating the number one ranked Georgia, a number one ranked Alabama, and now has a chance to beat Georgia again, this time for the Southeastern Conference Championship. I have no problem with Auburn at number two. Oklahoma at number three. Once again, Baker Mayfield, Lincoln Riley and company win the games on the schedule, aside from a loss to Iowa State. Lincoln Riley and company getting the job done. They have the Big 12 title game ahead of them. TCU, you beat TCU, you're in the big dance. Go crazy. You beat TCU. And at number four, Wisconsin, Paul Chryst. These guys were undefeated. Paul Chryst, Jonathan Taylor at running back, which, by the way, I get all the love for Saquon Barkley, but Jonathan Taylor is a 1,000-yard back. And this guy is putting the Badgers on the square of his shoulders and is getting the job done. The Badgers win. Paul Chryst and that staff know we're in. I have no problem with how the top four win.
What I do have a problem with is not the college football playoff rankings. It's some of the metrics that we use to determine how good these teams are. So we constantly see this statistic of top 25 wins. Okay, your top 25 wins change by the week. Are we talking about top 25 wins currently or at the time that you play that particular team? So, for example, Wisconsin, they're being hurt by continuing to knock teams out of the top 25. They played a top 25 team. They knocked them out of the top 25. They played Iowa, who was number 20. They beat them. So what do we do with Iowa? We don't say, well, they lost to one of the 3 or 4 best teams in the country. Let's keep them in the top 25. No, we knocked them out of the top 25. Therefore, Wisconsin no longer has that top 25 win. The next week, Wisconsin, same situation against Michigan. Michigan's a top 25 team at 8-2. Wisconsin beats them. What do? Instead of crediting Michigan with a close, it turned into a 2-touchdown game very late in the game, but they went toe-to-toe with Wisconsin on the road and saying, this is not a bad loss. This is actually a quality loss, and losing to Wisconsin on the road and keeping Michigan in the top 25. We boot Michigan out of the top 25. Therefore, Wisconsin's 2 top 25 wins, in addition to Northwestern, that people forget about that one as well. Northwestern's 9-3, and they're in the top 20 in the country. That Wisconsin no longer gets credit for these top 25 wins. They, in fact, were the team that knocked those teams out of the top 25. I think the top 25 is overrated. There's no difference, basically zero difference between number 27, number 28, number 32, and number 24, number 20. There is little separation once you get to about 15 to 40. Not a whole lot of separation between those teams. We need to be talking about quality wins against decent teams, not just automatically you're in the top 25, therefore your win counts versus this other team. They've got the same record, but they're somehow just at number 28, therefore that doesn't really count.
I think the committee needs to do a better job of really explaining the top 25 wins. As you mentioned, Mark, what do you put more on at the time you play them? Because there is so much buildup to at the time you play them. Everybody's focused on number one's about to play number 5. And there's so much buildup. You have all of this, off-field pomp and circumstance, so to speak, using a graduation musical term here. There's so much of this pomp and circumstance build up to particular games each and every week, and you say this is a marquee matchup. This is a headliner. This is the one right here. If this team beats this team, then there is no way that this team should be knocked out of a top 25, or a loss by this team should be held against the team that beat them. I think the committee needs to do a better job of underlining and laying out what is the bigger emphasis being placed on. When the moment you take the field with that team and they're in the top 25, or after you play that team, how does that team do? Because for example, you look at Alabama, Florida State. Florida State was 3, Alabama was 1. In the offseason, you heard so much about DeAndre Francois and this defense. It's got Brian Burns and Derek Nadee and Josh Sweat and Jacob Pugh and Matthew Thomas and Derwin James and Tavares McFadden. So many of these players, everybody from the Chick-fil-A Peach Bowl committee, everybody in the higher ups of that organization talking about how much of a greatest opener of all time matchup this is going to be. And prior to Francois getting hurt, it was a pretty competitive game. Francois was slinging the ball, up and down the field. The Florida State defense was playing well. And because of Francois getting hurt, you cannot account for that. And then after the fact, you just look at, Florida State would have never been good anyway. We could just wipe that under the rug. Well, if Francois stays healthy, you don't know how good this team could be. This could be a situation where Jimbo Fisher banks a lot on how healthy, how consistent, how critical DeAndre Francois is. So I feel like, as a whole, you need to take into account, do we factor in the top 25 wins the moment that these particular teams play? Or do we look at, after you play this team, after this team is in the rearview mirror, how do they get off the mat and respond?
So I think you bring up a great point. There needs to be perspective placed on it. It needs to be placed into context. So in this particular situation, did Alabama beat the third best team in the country? I think it's been shown over the ensuing 11 weeks that Florida State would not have been the third best team in the country. But did Alabama beat a 5-6 Florida State team? No, in no way did they take on the team that we're seeing over the latter half of the season with James Blackman at quarterback. They took on a highly talented team that was expected to vie for a college football playoff spot. We will never know what would have happened with Florida State this season with DeAndre Francois healthy for 12 games. We have no idea. We can only give a fair assessment based on the results and based on the knowledge of how good a quarterback he is and how much they suffered. We know that Florida State has elite talent. They have top 5 talent on that roster. Can anyone imagine that they would have been 5-6 with DeAndre Francois? No way. No how that they would have been that. Would a better team, would Alabama, would some other teams that we've seen in the past, Ohio State in 2014, completely wilt and crumble and completely vanish from the scene by losing their starting quarterback? No. So they need to take a hit for that. That Florida State team shouldn't be considered a number 3 win on Alabama's resume, nor should it be the 5-6 team. We should look at both perspectives because they played a fully armed and healthy Florida State team that probably was about to underachieve slightly, but still, I would consider it a top 15 win would be the balance that I would strike between those two ends of the spectrum.
And I would look at it the exact same way, Mark. But you and I both, excuse me, I brought up some good points here. When it comes to the committee, the quality wins against opponents that, even though they may not be in the top 25, just quality wins against guys that continue to win. I mean, if you look at Alabama right now, you see LSU after it lost to Alabama, ripped off 3 straight wins to finish the year at 9-3. You look at Mississippi State. Yes, it finished at 8-4, but you have to take into the account Nick Fitzgerald gets hurt against Ole Miss. This is Mississippi State's full offense, and when it played Alabama, this is a state team that took the tie down to the wire. And if it wasn't for a game-winning touchdown from Jalen Hurts to Devonta Smith, we don't know what truly could have become of that situation. Also, Alabama took on Fresno State at the beginning of during the early part of the season. Fresno State is 9-3 and is about to play against Boise State for the Mountain West Conference Championship. So hint, for all the Tide fans out there, pull for Fresno State. Fresno State wins. You end up at 10-3. The Bulldogs right now at number 25 in the college football playoff rankings. So they did crack the top 25. That's a good chink upward, in your armor. So, pulling for Fresno State. Would never thought I'd be pulling for Jeff Tedford and those Bulldogs, but hey, Fresno.
All right, Stephen M. Smith of Touchdown Alabama joins us each and every Wednesday night to talk Bama with the Tide on the sideline, not playing in Atlanta for the first time since 2013 when Auburn took on Mizzou. And Auburn's back at it, of course, after defeating Georgia and Bama in back-to-back SEC games to get a rematch with the Bulldogs in the SEC championship game. Should be a good one. Let's look at some playoff possibilities here. I'm going to size you up with some playoff possibilities. And, Stephen, I want you to tell me what you think the committee's going to do versus what you think should be done. So one is a conjecture on knowing how they operate and predicting what they would do versus you saying, yeah, I agree with that, or I think that this should happen, even though I don't think it will. So okay. I think we can agree, Stephen, that if the ACC is in based on winner take all, losers out between Miami and Clemson, then the rest of it's pretty muddied, except for the SEC, of course, the winners in with Auburn taking on Georgia. The losers most likely out. Maybe Georgia's got a claim in a close game, but let's say that those are winner-take-all situations. So in this scenario, there's an SEC winner, there's an ACC winner. Then Wisconsin wins the Big Ten and Oklahoma wins the Big 12. I would think that that is Alabama's worst nightmare, because Wisconsin's undefeated, Oklahoma's in front of Alabama already. Then they tack on another quality win, plus they won their conference. That would shut out the Crimson Tide. That's at least my thought.
That's 100% correct. That would keep Alabama completely out of the college football playoff, solely on not just being the conference champion, but also the resumes of all 4 teams would stack up pretty much a bit better than Alabama, with the exception of Wisconsin. But Wisconsin winning the Big Ten, that's a Big Ten championship from an undefeated conference champion. Yeah, if the chalk holds, if all 4 teams that win and the chalk holds, Bama's not getting in there.
Okay, previous experience tells us that chalk most likely won't hold, and also Vegas and the power indexes actually have teams that are tagged with a loss or two, namely Ohio State, as being the better team theoretically. Vegas has Ohio State winning this game like 65% of the time against Wisconsin. So let's start there. The Buckeyes win. They defeat Wisconsin. Does it matter what the score is? What do you think the situation has to play out? Do you think that enters Bama into the equation, and how heavily?
It enters Bama in the equation, but for me, Mark, I look at this. Ohio State more than likely would have to win a close game against Wisconsin. If it's a blowout, a definitive blowout, or a definitive win where the committee looks and sees Ohio State had complete control, Not a game where it's tightly contested, it's back and forth. You can't give a definitive scope on which team's got the advantage or has the edge. If this is a game where Ohio State has the edge from start to finish and it's definitive, then the committee looks at, okay, now Ohio State possibly has a case to get over on Bama into the college football playoff. Now, this is how I wouldn't put that in. How I would not put that in is if you look at Ohio State's 2 losses against Oklahoma and Iowa. Against Oklahoma, you lost by 2 touchdowns. You lost by 14 plus points at home in the horseshoe to Baker Mayfield. And then against Iowa, you get obliterated by 31. You lose by 4 touchdowns. JT Barrett has 4 interceptions in that game to an Iowa team that, yes, good team, 7-5, but the brand name Iowa not too high, not in the top 25. You get obliterated by Iowa. The only reason I can see the committee making a push for Ohio State in this sense is if TCU wins and if you, being Ohio State, just take Wisconsin completely off the map. If it's a close ball game, I see Alabama getting in there.
So how does the TCU situation factor into that? If everything happens as you just stated, let's say Ohio State wins a definitive game against Wisconsin, 59-0 comes to mind. That's been done before, 2014. I don't think it has to be anything close to that, but let's say it's 59-0 and Clemson goes and Auburn goes. You think Ohio State's going to get the nod. What does the TCU-Oklahoma situation have to do with that?
Well, the TCU-Oklahoma situation, I think that would firmly, because TCU right now is at 11. And I feel like TCU beating Oklahoma at 11, TCU's brand name isn't high enough to get them in versus an Ohio State that's a known commodity. No offense to Gary Patterson. Those teams fight hard. TCU plays strong defense. Kenny Hill is having a pretty solid season at quarterback right now. But if you look at Ohio State, due to the fact that should you handle Wisconsin definitively and play a marquee performance, your losses to Oklahoma, your loss to Oklahoma is a solid loss there. And then you have Iowa, though that's not a bad loss. It's a blowout loss, but they're going to find, the committee would find some way to justify Ohio State. I feel like there's some way they would try to justify the Ohio State loss to Iowa with the simple fact that Penn State won the Big Ten, did not get in. It's just crazy, but I would look at there'll be some type of loophole on where the committee would find a way to factor in Ohio State.
Stephen, the one team that doesn't get considered with a loss is Miami, and I don't completely understand that. Let's say Miami loses by 1 point to Clemson.
Okay.
And Clemson is the #1 team in the country. And on top of that, to make the case a little bit better for Miami and a little bit less for Alabama, just playing devil's advocate here, Miami gets that done in regards to a resume, a building outcome. They lose the game, but they lose by 1 point, 31-30. Great game. They lose to Clemson. Even if it's perceived, especially if it's perceived that they outplayed Clemson. Let's say Georgia beats Auburn. So Georgia's in, and now the Auburn loss, even though Auburn's a really good team, let's say Georgia handles Auburn. That is not as significant or a resume building type loss, losing to Auburn with 3 losses, that Alabama could stand up against Miami and kind of make that comparison that Miami actually has a better resume based on the Clemson decision with the same record.
And that's true. And that's what makes it all the more telling, because if Miami was to lose by 1 to Clemson, you would look at Miami's resume. You handled a very good Virginia Tech team. You laid the smackdown on Notre Dame. Yes, you lost to Pitt, but you go to Clemson and you outplay them, but you lose by 1. there's something to be said for that. And then if Georgia beats Auburn, Georgia's in, Auburn's out. Alabama didn't play Georgia from the East, so that really hinders Bama because now there's the only similar opponent that Alabama and Georgia would have is Auburn. But if Georgia beats Auburn, yeah. So it would not pan out for Alabama if Georgia was to beat Auburn.
Yeah, so let's say that the committee is completely on the up and up because you're talking about name brands. You've brought that into the discussion a number of times, and I think that's very valid. I think the committee would discount that. They don't want to be labeled as a committee that looks at the brand of Alabama, the brand of Ohio State, but it kind of started that way in 2014 when it gave the appearance that Ohio State won out over TCU and Baylor because of the name brand and the following and the credentials and the history. And that the same thing would hold true here. Let's pretend that that doesn't factor into it, and it's strictly an evaluation of the team, the resume, and the results on the field. Alabama still has the most credible loss out there of the teams that we're talking about, where that Pitt loss is ugly, that Iowa loss is ugly, and the committee's already made the precedent last year. This would be a different discussion this time last year, but the committee's already said, we will look at the resume, even if it's not a conference champion. And if we believe that that resume is better than a conference champion, then we're going to make the move. And they did that with Ohio State last year.
They did, which is why if you look at Alabama right now, you are hoping, if you're Alabama, you are hoping for a Fresno State win over Boise State, which would give Fresno State the Mountain West Conference Championship. You would have to take into account LSU, who is 9-3. They won 3 straight after losing to Troy and after losing to Alabama. You would have to take into account Mississippi State. Yes, they're 8-4, but still, this is a team that took Alabama down to the wire. They were in the top 25 prior to playing Alabama when they played Alabama. And I think the Bulldogs are still in the top 25 as we speak right now. So if you look at LSU, Mississippi State, and of course, Fresno State, should Fresno State beat Boise State. But then also, low key, and I get it, they made the move to get rid of, to move on from Kevin Sumlin. But you even look at 7-5 Texas A&M for just a moment. I mean, that game on the road at Kyle Field was a tough ball game. I understand people felt like, well, the game was never out of hand. Alabama was going to win that game from the get-go. But Texas A&M made a huge comeback in that ball game. And despite losing 27-19 back in October, if I'm not mistaken, at College Station, that was a huge football game.
I totally agree, Stephen. It's we could talk about this all night and spit out scenarios. And then the other distinction I would make in comparing last year's Ohio State team to this year's Alabama team is that Ohio State did go on the road last year at Oklahoma, a team that was highly ranked to start the season and finish top 5 in the country. And that's why it would be intriguing to be in that room to know what that room assesses Florida State being the first week of the season. We're kind of conjecturing on what we believe how that game should be measured, but it would be interesting to know. And I'm sure that there are varying thoughts on how you rate that Florida State win, because you can go either end of the spectrum on that one.